Welcome to Artificiality, brought to you by the founders of Sonder Studio. Artificiality is a podcast dedicated to understanding the emerging community that is humans and machines. We take the latest in the human side, decision science, psychology, and design, and put it together with advances in artificial intelligence and big data so that you can understand how to work better with machines and your fellow humans. We founded Sonder Studio to help people be more human in the age of AI. We're on this learning journey too, so we strive to find the frontiers, to ask the best questions, and stay curious. We interview some of the top minds working at the intersection of humans and machines and make sure we have a few laughs along the way. If you enjoy our podcasts, please subscribe and leave a positive rating or comment. Sharing your positive feedback helps us reach more people and connect them with the world's great minds. We all love stories. They're one of the most important ways that humans communicate. Stories create heroes to root for and villains to revile. Stories create realities and help us align our values and objectives with others. But how do stories change in a world that is awash with data and is overwhelmed by large tech companies that try to motivate or manipulate us with stories using data that we don't see and can't comprehend? To help answer these questions, we talked with Frank Rose about his recent book, The Sea We Swim In: How Stories Work in a Data-Driven World. Frank's book is inspired by his strategic storytelling seminar at Columbia University and is a wonderful resource to help understand the power of narrative thinking. In addition to being a senior fellow at Columbia University's School of the Arts, Frank is the director of Columbia's pioneering digital storytelling lab and a frequent speaker on narrative thinking and on the power of immersive storytelling. Frank's writing and journalism career started in the punk scene at CBGB for The Village Voice and continued as a contributing editor at Esquire and then Wired. He has written several books, including West of Eden, about the early days of Apple Computer, and The Art of Immersion, about how the digital generation changed storytelling. We greatly enjoyed talking with Frank about one of our favorite subjects, telling stories in a data-driven world. Frank, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. We're excited to be able to talk with you.
Great. Thank you, Dave. I'm excited to be here.
Maybe to start off with, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about who did you write this book for and how should they think about using it?
That's a great question. One of the key parts of the book is the sort of 9 essential elements of stories that I have developed as part of my Columbia University executive education program, which is called strategic storytelling. And one of the most key elements out of those 9 is the audience. And I feel like too many people don't consider the audience. They just consider, what do I want to say? What do I want to try to get across? That's not all that likely to be effective. But my audience, I think, or I should say at least the readership for this book is largely, I think, the kind of people who take the exec ed program, which is to say, people from really all walks of life, I guess you could say, but with a particular preponderance of, toward executives, whether in big corporations, tech corporations, small companies, entrepreneurs, nonprofits, all of that sort of thing. And the fact is that stories are essential for all of us. They're how we communicate. They're how we form our understanding of reality. And that's what I try to get across in the exec ed program, and that's what I'm trying to get across in the book. And the bulk of the book is sort of looking at how to do that.
One of the things that really struck me about the book was breaking it down into sort of 9 key things about stories. And you pulled together lots of from so many different worlds. It almost feels like a bit of screenwriting and a bit of understanding how data and algorithms work to understand how people are responding to stories. And I'm curious about how you thought about bringing that all together in terms of an overarching whole. because there's quite you've knitted a lot of things together to create almost a story in itself. And when you did that, what was surprising to you? What did you learn out of that process that was new?
It's funny. It took me about maybe a year and a half or so to write the book, but the genesis of it came much earlier than that, and so it's a little bit hard for me to answer that, except to say that really what happened was. I mentioned the exec ed program. After a while, after I've been teaching that for a couple of years, and I started in 2014, after a couple of years, I realized that I ought to sort of put together a toolkit for people who were taking the program. We give them the slides, of course, but my slides are primarily visual. They don't necessarily add up to, everything that was in the program. So I put together like maybe 24-page booklet, essentially, that kind of captured, I think, all the main points. And then I realized that, that could be the genesis of the book. So that's what part 2 is. That's the gist of the book, the biggest part, the 9 elements of story, et cetera. And, another thing that went into this is a couple of years after I started the executive education program, I started at the Columbia Digital Storytelling Lab. I started an awards program, which we call sort of colloquially the Digital Dozen. It's a program for to cite people who have created stories that kind of break the mold, that are innovative in form and function. The lab is founded, the Digital Storytelling Lab was founded shortly, not long before that, by Lance Weiler, who's a very well-known storyteller himself and is a professor at Columbia now. And so Lance and I, as we developed this program, one of the key things that went into it was the idea that we would not have categories. We feel like digital erases categories. At the very least, it blurs them. And there's no reason that we should try to keep them alive artificially. And the other thing is that quite apart from the fact that categories are kind of disappearing, is the fact that everybody is trying to learn how to use these new tools, tools that keep evolving. I mean, my previous book, The Art of Immersion, came out in 2011, and at that point, virtual reality was, barely seen as on the horizon. That changed, obviously, within a couple of years. And so these tools keep evolving, new ones keep coming. Now we're lost in the metaverse, and I think that's unlikely to change in the near future. That is to say, the idea that we won't be getting new tools. So that's not going to happen. This stuff is just going to keep evolving. And so what we ended up with was an awards program that, considers equally things like advertisements, journalism, art, film, video, just every sort of conceivable use case and every conceivable technology for telling stories, including live performance, because we're getting live performances now that would not be possible without digital technology. And so that's the other, sort of idea that went into this, I think. And, personally, my background is as a journalist, and I just love the idea of being able to go from, one discipline or one technology to another and describing, how they work and what they have in common and, what they have that's different. That said, I'm certainly not, the point of this book is not to, for example, tell virtual reality filmmakers how to do it. That's not, that's not the idea at all. The idea is to, sort of pull out what's important about storytelling, whatever the medium, and to see how that might work in different cases.
Your journalism career started quite some time ago, and you've been covering the tech industry since essentially the dawn of the internet.
Yes,
about, that sort of timeline. And I'm curious if you could sort of describe how you see how storytelling has changed in that interaction with technology over that timeline, both as someone who's writing stories, but also someone who observes and hears and embraces and lives with stories. How that change of the internet and data and all of the different sort of technologies, you could give us a little bit of an arc of history there. That would be
sure. And that was really something that I tried to do in my previous book, The Art of Immersion. That book came about because I spent 10 years as a writer, as a contributing editor at Wired, the magazine. And my beat, so to speak, while I was there was basically stuff at the intersection of media and technology, which was great because I had, at that point, I spent a lot of years doing one or the other, focusing on one or the other. And it was sort of a real treat to be able to put them both together. Now, that was great, except that around 2006 or 2007, I started to stumble into a series of stories that led me to realize ultimately that the way we change, the way we tell stories is changing in response to the internet, in particular in digital technology in general. And that realization was what led me to leave Wired. Ultimately, I'd been there for 10 years in any case, and to write The Art of Immersion, which is sort of what propelled me into my current direction, including this latest book. And what I realized after a while was that every time there's a major new communications medium that comes along, it's going to be 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, maybe longer, until we figure out a new form of storytelling that's native to that medium. The easiest example to cite is the motion picture camera, which was invented around 1890. And, people stumbled around. Everybody was fascinated by it, but they didn't really know what to do with it for a while. It was, at first movies were about 10 minutes long because that was the length of a reel of film. And they were shown in vaudeville houses, sort of like between cute animal acts and so forth. And it was 1915, 1916 before you regularly had films that, were what we would consider feature length, that had actual movie stars as opposed to anonymous actors, and that used all of the sort of conventions that we take for granted now, everything that we consider part of the grammar of cinema, like cuts and pans and fades and those sorts of things. Everything which, by the way, has to be reinvented for VR, but that's another story. And then it was still another 10 years or so before you had sound. And so what we are left with is, what we know now as movies. And, although the subject matter changes and, certain techniques change, and there's now a lot of, a lot of visual effects, of course, the basic, storytelling form of movies has not really changed very much since. If you want to go further back, another example is the printing press and movable type. It was 150 years before you after that before you got the birth of the novel. And the reason it was called the novel was because it was so new. It was a whole new way of telling stories that, instead of telling you about history or the gods or whatever, told you about ordinary people living their lives and gave you a window into their lives. So that's the kind of thing that's happening now, except that, it's still pretty murky. It's still pretty hazy where exactly it's taking us. But that's the kind of thing that I've been, sort of working to define, I guess you could say, since I did The Art of Immersion.
How did you think about stories versus facts? Daniel Kahneman says something along the lines of stories are far more compelling than facts. Mm-hmm. And how can we use stories for good? We always for good, but even flipping that around, how could we use stories to stop bad stories taking hold? We seem to be post-truth world. We almost need a post-story world, right? And how do we get stories to neutralize other stories that aren't true?
Yes, right, exactly. Well, we're seeing that a lot right now, and I think one reason we're seeing it so much is because, part of it is that there are certain actors who want to, who want to confuse the issue, who wants to confuse the difference between facts and fiction, or reality and unreality. But another part of it is that digital sort of makes it difficult to, increasingly difficult to tell the difference. And, the sort of one of the ultimate examples of that is deep fakes. I mean, we're beginning to see them more and more. Mostly so far, what we've seen is, actresses' headshots put on, porn actresses' bodies, which is, pretty disgusting behavior. But we're also starting to see it in the political realm, and I think we're only going to see more of it. There was, of course, this past March, the deepfake video that had President Zelensky of Ukraine telling people that they were going to surrender, and that was a pretty obvious fake. But they're only going to get more sophisticated, and one of the many people I talked to for the book is the CEO of a company in Amsterdam that looks at deepfakes, tries to figure out how to counter them, what to do with them, and basically like viruses, like computer viruses and the like. It's a game of whack-a-mole. And, what he said that really struck me was, future generations will look at us as being very strange that we were, able to, that we believed everything that we saw. He said that we happen to have lived, the last 150 years or so at a time when we could make records of what was happening, but we could not believably alter those records. And that's obviously what's changing. The question of how to counter that is a very, very important question. I don't have the answer right now. I'm joining a new group, which I can't talk about quite yet, but I would be delighted to later, that is going to be, largely devoted to trying to figure that out. But it's one of the most important questions, I think, that we're going to be facing.
Yeah, whenever we have these sorts of conversations about, this whole area, I don't think we've ever been left with any sense of optimism, mainly because there's just so many cognitive biases that work against us. Whether it's a truth bias, mm-hmm. bias for someone says something in a story and believe it's true, mm-hmm. or whether it's the simplification that comes with stories, because stories necessarily involve a certain degree of simplification.
Right.
And it does, the one place that we seem to come back to multiple times is whether or not technology can play a part in helping us feel more comfortable with uncertainty, and rather than, and to be able to sort of embrace doubt. And you get pretty philosophical pretty fast, whether it's
Right.
the philosophy of science or whether it's other things around how people think. But so much of what we observe, algorithms and AI and data being able to help other people manipulate other people with, is because people want to be part of an in-group, want to have a degree of certainty over an increasingly complex, fast-moving and uncertain world. And I was wondering whether there was anything in your research as you came across this, or any thoughts that you have about how we can actually use stories to find ways to feel more comfortable with uncertainty, to be able to embrace doubt in a different kind of way.
Right. I think I think the problem with doubt is that most people don't want it, and that's why we have faith. Not to be not to be too flip, but I feel like it's certainly possible, though. I think to do what you're talking about. I think that we need to understand. In order to do this, I think that we need to understand that you need to fight stories with stories. You're not going to fight stories with data. As much as I would like to believe it, is as much as I would like to believe that it's not true. The fact is, that people just don't like facts. There's obviously there's a market for facts, but the problem with facts is that they don't get people where they live, and where we live is in the emotions, and so that is what is so powerful. That's at least one of the things that is so powerful about stories and storytelling. Stories are emotional constructs, basically, and they are, designed, whether we think about it consciously or not, as we're telling a story. They essentially function as a way of tapping into, the audience's emotions, and the unfortunate thing is that facts just don't do that. And so, there's been a lot of really fascinating research into this, a lot of it having to do with, appeals for charity, that sort of thing. There's this thing you're probably familiar with it called the identifiable victim effect, which is essentially, this was first discovered in the 90s and has been, shown to be the case again and again. But the fact is that we're much more likely to give money to some cause if there's, a person who is sort of the face of that cause. I mean, the classic example is starving children in Africa or something like that. And it's been shown that even if there are two people, who are part of the appeal, two victims, we're likely to give, less than if there were one victim. And that's just sort of an extreme example of the problems, of using facts. Now, obviously, facts can appeal to the emotions too. It's just that, in order to do so, I feel like they have to be, wrapped in stories, because the truth is we just don't get abstractions. As much as many of us would like to believe that that's not the case, and I love to look at a good chart as much as anyone else does, but it's unless it's done really, really well, it's going to be hard to convince anybody who doesn't actually want to be convinced.
The chart itself doesn't tell the story. You have to tell the story for it.
Right. Or you can, there are ways that you can, use charts to tell a story. And if you are, adept at that, that can certainly be done. If charts are just presented as, as facts with no conclusion, then they're not going to be very effective. We have we've been doing the executive education program virtually for the last 2 years. And, one of the advantages that this gives us, and there's certainly, we're going back into the classroom, so to speak, this fall. But one of the advantages that we do get from doing it virtually is that we can have guest speakers from anywhere in the world. And there's this young woman in London named Valentina De Filippo, who has become our sort of regular guest speaker on data storytelling. And she's very, very good at at showing how stories can be woven from facts. It's not that stories repel facts or anything like that. It's just that presented on their own, facts are not terribly likely to convince anybody. And that has to do with abstractions. Stories are not abstract. Stories are about, real people, real individuals, real whatever is happening.
We teach workshops on data-driven decision-making. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, one of the things we help people understand is as you're making a decision using data, how do you think through getting other people on board with your decision? And one of the journeys we take them on is thinking about how to express that decision and tell the story about the data as a story. Uh-huh. Right. Because stories unify us. They bring us together. People like to be a part of a story, and they just get captured in it. And it's an interesting process to go through saying, here's the data and here's the decision we've made off the data. Now let's tell a story about that.
Right.
And some people that can be an intuitive thing. And for others, it's a bit more of a challenge. It's, they just sort of, look at it and say, well, here's the data, here's the facts. But once you get through saying, well, but what's the arc of that story? How do we think about that in that way? It takes them in a new place to sort of think about how to use stories in a way that they hadn't thought about before.
Yes.
It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that's great. And, the arc is very, very important, because one of the central things about stories is that they unfold over time. A story is not just a set of facts. A story is not just a situation. A story is, when you have, a character of any sort, and something happens that the character has to overcome, and because without some sort of challenge like that, there's no reason to care. And eventually the character manages to overcome it or not. But either way, you start in one place, possibly physically, but certainly in terms of time, and you end somewhere else. And, that's sort of one of the key points of storytelling, I think. And so, yes, if you can, find a way to, create an arc involving that sort of sums up the facts that you want to convey, that can be very, very effective.
One of the concepts you talk about in the book is narrative thinking. I wonder if you could describe narrative thinking, especially as it relates to design thinking, because I thought that relationship that you drew was quite interesting.
Yeah, there is a relationship, and the relationship is essentially that just as design thinking was, sort of created to so that people who were not professional designers could use the tools of professional designers and, come up with some solutions. Not necessarily to design problems, but to, all sorts of problems. And so what design thinking, or one of the key things that design thinking is all about, is, making the tools of professional designers accessible to, corporate executives, say, or anybody. And it's been very successful at that. The idea of narrative thinking is to make the tools of professional storytellers available to people who are not professional storytellers. So the tools of journalists or film directors or, musicians for that matter, and to, show people, to sort of lead them to help them to understand how stories work, what they're all about, and how they can use them. So, that's what narrative thinking is all about, and that's really what my Columbia program is focused on.
So interesting how quickly things are changing in the world of narratives with the evolution of powerful language models that create narratives from data. Not always sensible, not always the kind of story you want to read, but nevertheless, I mean, that's a significant change in the what's available as a technology, even to start the process of building a narrative, for example, or how you bring in an artificial intelligence into your own workflow.
Right.
And one of the things that really fascinates me about this interaction between humans and machines is, what's distinctly human and what's distinctly machine, and how you think about those two things working together. And imagination and improvisation are things that machines can kind of do. They sort of fake it, but it's all on previous data, and it can be completely absurd and nonsensical. It requires a human to judge whether or not it's makes sense, whether it fits taste. Humans are applying that curative, that curation over the top of it. As you've been teaching and exploring these ideas, where have you ended up thinking about how humans can really expand and augment and amplify their own imaginations using data and using technology? Because that's changed just so much in terms of the creative tools that are available. But do you see that some things has been like super commercially successful, whereas other things are more profound but less known? And how do you see that sort of whole relationship between imagination and creativity with data?
It's very interesting that you bring up imagination, because imagination, as you say, is just very central to humans, and probably, definitely not not central, or certainly not central yet, to machines. And I hadn't thought of this before, but a key reason might be memory. Computers, as we know, can remember just about anything that they've been informed about, and humans do not. Experiments have shown time and again that our memory is tied up with our imagination. If we, for some reason, can't imagine something, we're also not going to be able to remember something else, and vice versa. There have been some very, very interesting experiments about that. And centering on people who've had, for example, a certain kind of brain damage that that causes them to not be able to remember things. They've been asked to describe scenes, just typical scenes that any of us could describe, like, you're sitting on a beach, or you're in a park, or that sort of thing. And what is it that you see? And they can't do it. So I wonder if this idea of imagination isn't tied to, which is clearly central to storytelling as well, isn't tied to our lack of memory, and if that isn't actually a handicap for machines. I don't know.
We do know AI designers who definitely talk about, what are the problems for machines is they never forget, and humans definitely have, selective forgetting and memories that are retrieving memories being generative. You create them and you generate it as you retrieve the memory. One of the things that I found delightful in your book is I finally found someone else who had read Ian McGilchrist's book, Master in the Immersive. And I just loved that book. And it was such a striking idea that there's so much to talk about in terms of left brain and right brain. And they're different consciousnesses, and whether there's the way that stories almost help us integrate all of those things about our own perceptions of the world, and help us tap into that cause and effect reasoning, help us sense make, and satisfy that drive for sense making that is so underappreciated, that we just have to make sense of something. So if someone presents us with something that sparks our imagination or sparks our curiosity or grabs our attention, and then it's allowed to unfold. And that, to me, is something that is very underappreciated in the AI world, that things should be allowed to unfold, whether it's a relationship. So the relationship you have with technology doesn't all need to be in one place at one time. It can be allowed to unfold, allow people to almost follow through in almost a UX sense, that it's like a story. So I think there's so much you can take out of understanding stories, because it literally is understanding how we think, and get machines thinking more right brain as opposed to left brain, and helping us create our own imagination, helping us guide our attention more. I mean, there's so much to say about that. I think there's a quote
that you close the book with. It's this wonderful quote from David Foster Wallace, and I'll just read it out. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. But if you cannot or will not exercise this kind of choice in adult life, you will be totally hosed. I love Wallace. Uses language. And that was a quote that you brought up from, I guess it was maybe 15 years ago or so at a graduation, I think at Kenyon College, I think was the reference. But I particularly like the quote because it taps into the existentialist view, for me at least, that we are the accumulation of our choices. In part, we are what we choose to pay attention to. And in the book, you talk about how in the modern digital world, we're bombarded with stories. I think about it as because of the title, I think about it as we're getting thrashed around in the sea of stories. And that bombardment is driven by technology that tricks us into paying attention. And I found myself, after reading that ending part right at the end of the book, and sort of thinking that, well, in some ways that's sort of a depressing complexity, of technology manipulating us to pay attention to the stories that matter to the owners of the algorithms. But then I wondered whether throughout all of this, if there's are there any few recommendations that you have for people, given the context that you have over multiple decades of thinking about stories in the context of technology, but there are a few recommendations you have for people to try and follow Wallace's, recommendation of making an active choice of which stories to pay attention to.
Right. Well, thank you. I love that quote from David Foster Wallace, and that was a commencement address that he gave at Kenyon College in Ohio, a small liberal arts school, in, I believe it was 2005. It was the same year that Steve Jobs gave his famous address at Stanford, and by coincidence. And, Wallace was I mean, Wallace was just brilliant, obviously. And what he was doing was challenging his audience and, challenging them to make use of the education that they had hopefully just received, and to put it to good use. And the central thing that I think we have to keep in mind is that the brain is a pattern-seeking organ. We always want patterns. We want to find patterns, and stories give us patterns. They give us right patterns, they give us wrong patterns. It depends on the story and the storyteller. But if you look at something like QAnon, it's all about, here's some secret pattern that reveals everything that's really going on in the world that us, people who are relatively powerless and so forth, now we can find out. Now we can share this knowledge. Now we can, quote unquote, do our homework. And, you see this in religion a lot. You see it in, all kinds of stories, whether they're, benign or malign, whether, whatever type of stories they are. We're going to use them to make sense of the world. And that's that's one of the key things that I got from Jerome Bruner, who's a sort of also a central figure in the book. Bruner, of course, was he's one of the leading psychologists, most influential psychologists of the 20th century, and lived and worked well into the 21st. He was a leader in the revolt against behaviorism in the 1950s at Harvard when B.F. Skinner, the chief proponent of behaviorism, was the head of the department. And in the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, well after behaviorism was sort of consigned to the graveyard, and cognitive psychology had won, so to speak. He began to think about stories and the role that stories, play in our lives. And this was at a time when, most psychologists were very suspicious of stories. They, saw no reason to study them, study how they worked or anything like that. They considered stories to be frivolous. It was like, cheap entertainment. So you go to the movies, that's fun. But, we're important, serious people, and we, consider important, serious subjects. Well, Bruner, stood up and said, there are few more important, serious subjects than storytelling. And his point was that, there are two modes of thought, as he put it. There's logic and reasoning, and there is, and there are stories, and they're fundamentally different from one another. And that in order to, understand how the world works and how people form opinions and how people, have a, come up with a sense of reality, we have to understand stories. Because that's, the basis of the reality that we construct for ourselves. And it very much is a construction, I think. Reality is not something that, presumably it exists out there somewhere, but we're not equipped to find it. We don't have the, eyes that can see ultraviolet or infrared. We don't have ears that can hear, frequencies that dogs and other animals can hear. We get a limited perception of the world, and we tell each other stories in order to, sort of figure it out. That's how it works. And, so in a way, my two, lodestars, I guess you could say, for this book were Bruner and David Foster Wallace, because, between them, I felt like in very, very different ways, I felt like they had a, sort of a key insight into into how people work and what the role of stories is.
Yeah, I thought you had a really nice insight about the twin directions of digital media, and you kind of touched on the nature of reality and the nature of truth. And this elimination of uncertainty versus the blurring of reality to the point that it's impossible to determine what is certain. I thought that was a really interesting insight. And we had an interview with the author of The Nexus a few weeks ago, and one of the things that they've talked about is how we've got to get better at thinking in trade-offs as we go into a much more complex world. And one of the things that I wonder is whether, how much you agree with Harari and his view that we need totally different stories. We need a totally different way of constructing a different kind of reality and telling ourselves different stories. And when you think about the role of technology in that, and the concept of perception and birds and animals having different perceptions of the world and different perceptions of reality. Now, there's no question that AI has a different perception of reality than we do.
Right.
Whether it's being able to see into high dimensional space, or being able to see patterns and correlations and things that we would never be able to understand. Have you thought about how to layer stories on so much of on something that we can't even have a perception of? Is that the role of the metaverse? Is that the role of digital technology to really sort of give us a different sense of the perceptions that are possible? And what would happen if we started telling stories like that in a totally different way?
No, that's a very, very interesting idea, and I'm not quite sure, but yes, certainly. An artificial intelligence is going to have a very different perception of the world than we do, and that's one of the, that's one of the key things that I think is going to be problematic in terms of using AI to tell stories, because, as I say, it's you have to think about the audience as much as you think about yourself and what you want to say. And if the AI doesn't understand us, and if we're the intended audience, then the AI is likely to have a problem. At the moment, in terms of actual coherent stories, I feel like, AI is mainly useful for a story that's an accumulation of facts. Like a play-by-play in a ball game is a perfect example. It may or may not get the emotion of, a winning touchdown or a winning goal or whatever, but it can certainly fake it, I'm sure. But the idea of creating a whole new kind of storytelling or a whole new that sort of thing. Maybe that's what we're groping towards, with machines right now, with digital machines and digital technology. As I said earlier, when we have new machines, new technology that, helps us to tell stories in different ways, it takes us a long time to figure out what to do with it and to develop a form of storytelling that's native to that medium. And, I feel like you've really hit on something that's critical here, which is that's what's happening now with AI and with digital technology in general, including VR and AR and so forth. And so we're just sort of groping toward new forms of storytelling, and it's going to take us a while. It probably won't take us as long as it took us to develop the novel, but it may take us as long. Well, actually, it already has taken us as long as it did to figure out what feature films were, right? The other thing I'd like to say about Harari is, I love it that, he views practically everything as a story. Like money is a story, nations are a story. And that's true. And that gets to a sort of another, slightly different understanding of stories. What we've been talking about mainly is, stories that are, sort of told as that have a narrative arc and that sort of thing. But it's really possible to generate a whole, constellation of stories. As Robert Schiller describes them in his book, Narrative Economics. And this constellation of stories is the kind of thing that, I think that Harari is talking about. And they're incredibly useful and powerful if they're done right, because they reinforce each other. All of the stories that we hear about money, form our understanding of what money is and how it works. And now, of course, we have this sort of upstart idea of money that, maybe it doesn't have to come from governments after all. Maybe it can, be generated by a, ledger system on a computer. And so that's the kind of thing that's happening. And that is, I think these are among the things that, that generate the kind of, doubt, including even existential doubt that we're talking about earlier. And I think most people find find doubt in general, very discomforting. We feel like we tend to feel that we need some certainties in the world. And in fact, we live in a pretty random universe in which, well, I won't get into the religion aspect of that, but let's just say, as I suggested earlier, we tend to, many of us, most of us even, tend to want something that's going to, remove doubt, that's going to provide us with some sort of certainty. And, that's natural enough. We all, like to live in rooms with 4 walls and a ceiling and a floor, or, maybe 6 walls, but whatever. And that's, it's all something that we have to live with and we have to figure out how to deal with, but it doesn't make it any easier.
If I could close with a question, I'm curious, in addition to your book, obviously, but if you were to give listeners 3 ideas of whether it be stories to read or storytellers to study, broadly, what 3 things that people should pay attention to advance their sort of knowledge of storytelling, what would those 3 books or things be?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of them is this book, On Writing, by Stephen King. It's a wonderful book about, obviously writing, but about storytelling. And he sort of manages to weave in his own story, his biography, his autobiography, as he's, giving us lots of tips about how to tell stories. And so I think that's just a wonderful thing. And, I tend to not put too much truck in books that try to give us formulas, right? I don't think formulas are necessarily a good thing. There's this book, Oliver Sacks, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, which is basically just a whole series of stories about his patients. This sort of maverick neurologist and his patients. This came out in the 80s, I think. Yeah, in the early 80s. And it's I think it's the book that really put Oliver Sacks on the map, certainly on my map anyway. And then this is a book that I sort of stumbled across while I was researching mine. I quote it fairly extensively in a couple of places. It's by a professor at UCLA, retired professor now, named Richard Lanham, and it's called The Economics of Attention, Style and Substance in the Age of Information. And of course, it's no secret that, we're in what many people call an attention economy, in which the sort of balance of power, if you will, between, information and the attention that we're able to give that information has been totally reversed from what it historically was. It used to be that we had too little information, and now we have way, way, way too much. And so that means that attention is, increasingly a problem. Where do we put our attention? This is obviously also the kind of thing that David Foster Wallace was talking about in his commencement talk. And what I love about this book, about Richard Lanham, is that he has many insights into, kinds of ways stories are being told that are not necessarily obvious. And he has this idea that he calls this concept of attention structures, which is to say, things that are, built or created or, that we have solely to get attention and, to attract people's attention. This idea of attention structures is I think, really a really powerful idea. And it's something that people can use, in storytelling quite a lot, and especially in the kind of storytelling, this sort of constellation of stories, as Schiller describes it. And what I call narrative platforms. When you put enough stories together, you can create a platform, a sort of ad hoc platform that is going to be very supportive of whatever it is you're trying to get across, whether it's marketing for a film or people's understanding of your company or whatever, and so I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Those are three wonderful recommendations of books, and in particular, Oliver Sacks' book. It hits us personally. That book was one of the motivators for one of our children to start pursuing neuroscience. So that's interesting. And Stephen King's On Writing is one of the few books that I've read at least 3 times. I found it to be quite a compelling book from the weaving of his narrative about how he writes and his story to helping other people think about writing and stories. And I thought it captured me so much that it is one of the few books that I've read more than once. Right. So, but anyway, thank you so much for your time. We've really enjoyed this. We hope that other people will buy your book and read your story as well. And it's been a great pleasure to talk with you.
Great. Thank you. It's been a terrific pleasure for me as well. Wonderful questions and great discussion. Thank you.
Stay